Joining us now, live in studio for the first time, is Paul Callan, CNN legal analyst, also former New York City homicide prosecutor and criminal defense attorney at Callan, Koster, Brady and Brennan. Great to see you.
Nice being with you, Steve.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you here. All right, let's talk about Stop and Frisk. Of course, in your former capacity as New York City homicide prosecutor, the judge said basically this is a violation of the Constitution, the 4th and 14th Amendments. It's racial profiling by proxy, if you will, and she wants the whole thing revamped, an oversight, for federal oversight for the NYPD. It's really a nightmare for NYPD and, I believe, for the people of New York City.
I'd have to agree with you. It's a total nightmare. And, you know, it brings me back memory-wise to when I was a prosecutor starting out in this city. This city has no institutional memory. And I say that because when I tell stories to younger people, people under the age of, say, 40, about what life was like in New York in the 70s and the 80s, their eyes widen and they're shocked. For instance, you get on a subway train. You didn't know what stop to get off of because graffiti covered all of the windows in the train. The only thing you could see is when the doors opened what stop you were at. Homeless every place in the city. People urinating on the streets. You go out for a carton of milk, as I did on East 41st Street, around the corner from here. I had a gun put in my back in a very well-known grocery store in the early 1980s. Times Square was just crime every place.
And 2,000 people murdered a year, at least in 1990, and most of them minorities.
Most of them minorities, and that was a lesson that I learned when I was in homicide in the Brooklyn DA's office. You know, every 8 days we were on 24-hour call. When there was a homicide, I'd go out to the scene in the middle of the night in the back of a police cruiser. Very exciting way to start my legal career. But it hardened you real fast because, you know, I'd get maybe to a Chinese restaurant where there'd be some poor soul laid on the back dead with some rice in a bowl next to him, and you'd find out $15 had been taken in a robbery by some guy with a gun.
Going on, a lot of delivery.
It was such a dangerous.
So what is it that the judge is missing here? Is it not? Let's get back to the case specifically. Was NYPD violating the constitutional rights of the people they were stopping and frisking?
No, they weren't. And I think the reason I tell this story about what the city was like is because it's not like that anymore. We're the safest big city in America, as Mayor Bloomberg said yesterday. And it's because the police have been aggressive in getting the bad guys off the street, getting the guns off the street, and we had a transformation in this city into the finest big city, certainly in America, but maybe even in the world. Compare us to Chicago, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Georgia, Washington, D.C., all very dangerous cities with less aggressive policing. Now, the judge in this case has said there's a pattern of what she calls indirect discrimination against minorities, particularly African Americans in the city. Now, I don't know what she means by indirect discrimination. It seems to me if you're a racist and you discriminate, you do it either directly or you don't do it at all. But the reason she uses that wording is because what's happened is statistically, and you can argue about statistics, but approximately 70% of shootings are done by minority suspects. Sadly, 70 to 80% of the victims are black and Hispanics. So needless to say, when the police are out trying to get a shooter, they're going to be more likely to stop somebody who's a minority. I mean, after all, 70% of the shooters are minorities than Caucasians. Now, we can say, gee, that's really not fair. Maybe they should be stopping little old white ladies, too. But they're looking to get the guys who are most likely to be the criminals. Right. And as a result of that, aggressive policing, yes, they do stop people sometimes who don't have guns. But you know what's happened with it? And this is something the judge really doesn't talk about. Because the bad guys know they may be stopped by the police, they're not carrying the guns anymore. And people are not being endangered in minority communities throughout the city because the bad guys are leaving their guns at home because the cops may stop them. Now, the judge says, well, because in 90% of these stops, the cops don't come up with a gun, this is an unconstitutional violation of law. Well, I say it's not, because the police have individualized reasons for making these stops, and often, by the way, even though when they don't come up with a gun, they may come up with marijuana or some sort of illegal contraband that could justify the stop.
Will this be overturned on appeal?
Hard to say. I think it will be overturned on appeal, but bear in mind, we have a new mayor coming in New York, and Bloomberg has said he's filing an appeal. Virtually every electable candidate, and by that you have to say people in the Democratic primary.
They all favor this.
Yeah, they all favor it, and because they're pandering for votes. But what they're all going to forget is if we backslide into the kind of dangerous place we were before, everybody's going to rue the day that this decision was handed down.
Absolutely. We're talking to Paul Callan, CNN legal analyst, former New York City homicide prosecutor, criminal defense attorney here on the Steve Malzberg Show. All right, quickly, let's go to Eric Holder and his announcement yesterday that once again the Obama administration, and they've done it on health care, they've done it on immigration, they've done it on recess appointment, they're going to decide to enforce portions of the law, whatever they see is fit, or not enforce portions of a law. And this in particular is the goal is to get put less people in jail on drug arrests, people that they determine to be low level, not part of gangs, not part of a drug selling ring, and they're going to not include the quantity of the amount of drugs that they were caught with so as not to qualify them for mandatory minimum sentencing. I mean, I had on former U.S. Attorney General Mike Mukasey yesterday, who said that Eric Holder's breaking the law by doing this.
Well, I have to agree with Judge Mukasey. He is breaking the law. And, you know, these laws, and you may agree or disagree with these laws. I disagree with a lot of these drug laws. I think some of them, the penalties are too harsh. But we have a democracy. And in this democracy, these laws were voted in by a majority of the electorate. And they were voted in largely because during the crack epidemic, the criminals were largely the people who were using these drugs. And these laws were designed not just to get a street user, but to get the guy who was selling this poison to people, particularly in minority communities. Right. For the Justice Department now to come in and say, well, we're going to ignore the law, we're going to ignore what democracy mandates, and simply not bring these prosecutions, I think it may be illegal, but it's certainly immoral and it's certainly undemocratic.
He also mentioned that I asked him, could someone go to court to try to, make this not happen? He said that the only person or people that he could see having standing is Congress, because they passed a law which now the Justice Department will not enforce, and either Congress could capitulate by changing that law, or Congress could take them to court. Would you think that they would have standing to do so?
I think Congress might have standing to do so, but frankly, I don't think you'll get the votes in Congress to initiate such an action against the President and the Attorney General. Mm-hmm. So I think in reality, you're kind of stuck. If Holder doesn't want to enforce these laws, he's not going to. And ironically, I think, segging back to what we were just talking about, guess who's going to be running the New York City Police Department if we follow this federal judge's order? Holder and the Justice Department. Yeah. They're going to be putting cameras on cops on the street to discourage them from having interactions with people they think are criminal. And how do you think the average cop on the street's going to act? It's very easy for him to go and have a donut and a cup of coffee as opposed to risking his life, stopping somebody who he thinks is a bad guy.
And risking his career.
You bet. Risking his career in a lawsuit. And it all comes back to Eric Holder and the Obama administration.
It is a shame, but I always say welcome to the Obama nation. Joining us today was Paul Callan, CNN legal analyst. You watch him on CNN. You saw him there today, and you'll see him there again real soon. Former New York City homicide prosecutor, criminal defense attorney at Callan, Koster, Brady, and Brennan. I look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks,
always nice being with you.
All right, folks, we're going to return right here. Anything of interest that you want to discuss, please, 855-777-9660 on the Steve Malzberg